Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Join us today for our first seminar for the spring session of 2022. Thank you all for joining from all over the world, US, Canada, India, Nepal. I welcome you all. Happy New Year. My name is Dil Tavaraja. I'm an associate professor leading Clemson University Pulse Quality and Organic Nutritional Breeding Program. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors for our program, the United States Department of Agriculture, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, NIFA OREI projects, and the USAID Feed the Future Innovation Lab, South Carolina Department of Agriculture, the Good Food Institute, and the Food Short Global. And also, I like to thank the organizing committee, especially my program manager, Mr. Tristan Lawrence, inviting all the speakers and arranging everything. Thank you, Tristan, for organizing everything. Today, we have a very renowned speaker, one of my old professors from University of Saskatchewan, but the moderation and introduction done by one of my PhD student, Mr. Mark Dempsey. So Mark, I would like you to take the floor from here.
Thank you, Dil. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Steve Shirtliffe, from the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Shirtliffe is a professor in the Department of Plant Sciences. His position involves teaching, research, and outreach in the areas of agronomy and weed control. His primary research area is in field crop agronomy, where for the last 20 years he's been conducting field-based research. That research has focused on the ecology and control of volunteer canola, cereal and pulse and oilseed agronomy, non-herbicidal weed control, and agronomic applications of unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. And we're really excited and grateful for Dr. Shirtliffe to be here with us today. And from there, I'll just go ahead and hand it right over.
Well, thank you very much, Mark and Dil. And it's indeed a pleasure to be here today and to be down in the Carolinas. I was just saying up here in Canada, it is freezing cold right now. It was minus 33 Celsius when I woke up this morning, which is even unseasonably cold for here. So it's great. And the Carolinas is a place I've never visited, but it would be, I know I've always been intrigued by that particular part of the south of the US. So yeah, anyways, I'm going to start sharing my slides right now. And hopefully everything goes okay. We had a little practice session here and we'll get it on. Things seem to be acting very slowly. Oh, there we go. Are we seeing the correct screen there? Okay, I'm not hearing any. Everything look good, Dil? Give me a thumbs up. It was good?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so welcome today. Today we're going to talk about organic weed control and small grain crops. We're from up in Saskatchewan. This is a grain belt of Canada. It's really an extension of kind of that semi-arid area that runs up through Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, those areas, that kind of the Great Plains of North America, that, you know, where buffalo used to roam and the First Nations people lived there harvesting that until the Europeans came along and turned everything upside down. And now we're growing crops there. But so I'm going to talk to you about organic weed control and small grain crops. And we've been doing this for a long time, and we've always had a very applied focus to this side of the research and try to help organic farmers in Saskatchewan and the world by default, but mostly in Saskatchewan because that's who funds us. So anyway, so organic weed control, we're going to talk today about managing crop competition, mechanical weed control, integrating those methods. And if I have time, I'm going to talk a bit about managing weed seed return as well within an organic system. Okay, the first thing I'll talk about here, and the crops we're dealing with. I'm going to be talking mostly about small grain pulses, and a lot of my research is centered around lentil. But as we talk, these principles are applicable across other small grains as well. What I'm showing you here is a video of lentil growing, just a stop fun, and I want to press upon you a couple things. The first thing is that lentil's a very small crop. You can see it's done there. Oh, it's started. It should be starting again. Let's see if I can start it. You can see it's small. It starts out small, and and it takes a while for the canopy to fill in. I always encourage my students to simplistically think in terms of an agronomic way of a canopy as a solar panel. It's out there. Its job, as you know, what your job is to manage that solar panel so that it fills in, so that it builds itself as quickly as possible, and so it can maintain itself to harvest as much solar energy as possible, because that's what crops do. Really, they're kind of a self-replicating solar panel that we harvest the energy off of in terms of the seed off of them. So, but what you do see in a crop like lentils is when it starts is that there's a lot of spaces and a lot of holes. So we can deal with that and deal with that, and that's true in almost any crop, even like maize, or corn. And soybean, there's a lot of space out there that isn't occupied at the beginning. And this idea of like managing space and time in weed control gave rise to the critical period of weed control. And here's just showing a lentil crop. And again, they're, sometimes I even refer to them kind of offhandedly as a crappy little crop. And I don't mean that they're bad, but they're not like corn or wheat or canola, which grow large. They're a very short crop. But the key thing about these crops is weed control is very difficult in here. In this diagram, in this picture on the left, you can see this is a lentil crop that's been kept relatively weed free. The one just beside it with a bunch of wild oat growing in it is one where there hasn't been effective weed control, and obviously there's going to be almost no crop yield here. When I started doing organic weed control, it was probably almost 20 years ago, and I started research on that. I remember my first reaction was, and the provincial government was saying, well, we have a growing lentil industry in the province, and we're thinking that perhaps we can do some work in the organic area, because we think there might be some synergy. People who eat pulses like organic and that sort of thing, there might be a reasonable market in that area. My first thought was fear, because I was scared, like, how am I going to grow a crop like lentil without any herbicides, and I thought that was crazy. To be honest, I thought it was doomed to failure. And but I took the money anyways and did my best, and we'll see how that worked out. But we're here back to the critical period of weed control. We see in lentil here, and I won't explain the graph that much, but we determined that you have to keep it weed free, or the weeds suppressed as much as possible from the 5 to the 10 node stage. Essentially, this is when you have to start killing the weeds at the 5 node stage to keep controlling them. And after the 10 node stage for annual weeds, you can kind of let them grow because the crop's big enough, it can compete with them. So it's challenging there. So let's talk about some general kind of extension kind of principles. I chose to use kind of an outreach type of talk today to talk to you guys about, and just to keep it simple, to outline some of the agronomic principles here. And the first principle here is crop variety selection. And Dill is an organic breeder and or working in that area. And the principle would be to select a more competitive crop variety if it's available and known. And so we'll go through this, and I'll just do a little bit in this one. And some of the work that we've done that had the most success is we had a student, Josh Spies, who worked on field pea, and he looked at the difference between leafed and semi-leafless field peas. And so these are peas, they're grown up in Saskatchewan for dried peas, like you would get split pea soup, or it's in countries such as in South Asia, peas are split yellow peas or split green peas are used in dals and that. And actually there's a huge, it's not huge yet, but there's a lot of interest in using pea starch as a vegetable-based protein source, and we're seeing an industry developing here in Western Canada to extract protein from these sources. And actually, we had James Cameron. Well, he actually just sold it, but James Cameron used to own a organic pulse processing plant in Saskatchewan, and was looking into that part of the area as well. But anyways, that aside, so peas were one thing. So there are leafed and semi-leafless peas. Semi-leafless peas don't have leaves on the stipules here. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, it allows these little tendrils to grow, and the crop can actually twine itself together. And what that does is it keeps the peas from lodging, falling over, because this crop it's kind of peas, as if you've grown peas in your garden, you know, the peas like to climb on things. So when you grow them alone, they don't really have anything to climb on but themselves. And if they have the leaves there, they tend to fall over more. So the ones with the stipules tend to be more erect. However, when you get rid of those leaves, obviously the idea is that you should probably do get a little bit of less light interception. So Josh looked at some different varieties of peas, and the first thing we looked at is these, and you can see at the bottom there the names. And I'll just draw your attention to the second one from the left, and that's this variety 4010. It was a forage pea, and it had its crop biomass was essentially unaffected by the presence of weeds. It was a long-vined, leafy pea genotype that had incredible weed suppressive abilities. Whereas the other varieties were, well, one of them wasn't Sonata, which is in here, or maybe Sonata. Yeah, Sonata was another leaf one. It wasn't as good as 4010, but the other semi-leafless ones, weed presence affected them much more. And as well, the other side of weed, one of the reasons I'm showing you this is to show you there's two sides of kind of organic weed management or non-herbicidal weed management. The first is maintaining your biomass or yield in the presence of yield, so the tolerance of it. And the second one would be is the suppression of the weeds. And this one you can see that second column here is that 4010 was quite good. And it looks like it's cut off in the slide a little bit. But so the second one, 4010, was able to suppress the weed biomass by a lot. Well, peas were a great example of this. Unfortunately, in a lot of other crops, the varietal differences are not as great. Because here we had a distinct phenotypic difference between the two crops. One had those stipule leaves, the other didn't. And the vine length differed. In a lot of crops, it's a lot more difficult. So breeders have more of a challenge doing it. Here again, just showing the kind of the difference between those two peas. So the principle would be to select a more competitive crop variety as known. Often we don't know what varieties are most competitive. And often, you know, when you evaluate it, often the modern weedy varieties, the plant breeders out there, they've been doing a good job. And often the varieties that yield well under conventional situations also yield well under organic situations. And there are other things you can do to increase their competition with the weeds. So there are, of course, new ways of looking at this that are being done there, and there's some recent success and some others. But in general, we just don't know what varieties are more competitive. So you can't really give this as a recommendation. The next one we'll talk about is looking at something else. And here I'll just show you a trial, and you can see this is this is showing different levels of treatments, and you can see how it varies from being essentially all weeds. Obviously, there's no crop, to a lot of weeds. In this case, the yellow color is wild mustard, and you can see wheat heads in there. And then you can see that you're getting more and more suppression of it till you get not that much weed compared to a fair bit of weeds when you have some crop present. And what I'm going to be talking about, this one is seeding rate. And this sounds like a really simplistic method, and it is a really simplistic method. But to be honest, in the organic world, one of the best ways farmers can do to manage their weeds, other than trying to keep the populations down, to manage the competition, is to simply increase the seeding rate to aid in weed crop competition. And we'll look at again. This is some work we did in lentils here. That short crop. And this is some work we did quite a few years back with Julia Baird, who's since gone on to become a professor in agricultural economics at Brock University. But she did her MSc in agronomy, and I drove her away, I guess. But anyways, if you look, this is increasing on the x-axis. We are increasing our seeding rate. The red line shows the recommended seeding rate conventional situations. And this is the average of 4 site years grown we actually grew these on organic farms. And we're showing you the crop biomass. That's this asymptotic line starting at 0 and going up. Obviously, if you see no crop, you have 0 yield. And then you can see the weed biomass line trending down. And what you see is as you increase your crop seeding rate, you're getting more crop biomass and less weed there. You know, if you're growing at the recommended seeding rate, you're probably getting, on average, we got about the same crop biomass as weed biomass. But as you increased it, and with lentils, what we found is increasing it by even doubling it, or in some cases even more, you're able to keep suppressing your weed biomass down to a further level. And you can see here, we were subsequently able to increase our crop yield too, because of the large premiums for organic lentil that are normally there. They're not always there. It was economic at that time to increase it to the maximum seeding rate. So we greatly recommended that farmers increase it. And here you can see what a high seeding rate in the lentils looks like. Of course, we're still seeing some weeds come through because it is organic. We don't have a herbicide to control the weeds here, but you could end up with a lentil plot in this case that had reasonable yields. These yields of, over 1,000, 1,200 pounds per acre, is quite reasonable for lentils. We're not at as high as the conventional levels, but this is certainly farmers would be making lots of money growing this. And, I since had lots of farmers or organic farmers say that this did really change their thing. The same relationship, the same shape of this kind of essentially adding more crops there to take the place of the weed biomass holds true in other crops. Here's field pea showing a similar relationship. In field pea, however, because of the price of the seeds are quite large, it didn't really pay to increase the seeding rate that much. In wheat, the same idea. You increase your crop seeding rate, you increase your weed biomass. It's just a kind of a general rule here. And in wheat, though, we see it kind of the yield benefit leveled off, but we're still seeing a weed suppression benefit at that. So it's just kind of a simple thing here. So to increase your seeding rate to aid in competition, in reality, it's the most effective way to increase both the crop yield and reduce weed growth available, especially in poorly competitive crops, and a rule of thumb, and this is Chuck Moeller, Charles Moeller. He just recently passed away, but him and Matt Liebman wrote a book on organic weed control. I think it's actually in his 3rd edition now. And he came up with a recommendation, and I agreed with him that it should be at least 1.5 times what the recommended rate is under organic conditions in most kind, and consider increasing it even more if there's evidence for that. Crop row spacing is something else that gets into that spatial relationship of what's happening with crops and trying to leave less room for the weeds, as we talked about that original paradigm model, as use as narrow a seed row as possible. And maybe some of this work theoretically kind of comes from Jacob Wiener. People have been doing this all along, but Jacob Wiener is a professor over in Denmark. He's actually an American from Brooklyn, but he moved to Denmark, and he's looked at crop competition and the spatial effect of it. And here you can see wheat grown in a kind of an equidistant type of pattern versus wheat grown in rows, and the suppression on weeds there. And Jacob did some really nice modeling. Obviously, if you have a uniform population, you can see, as opposed to random, or if you think in he doesn't show it here, but rows over time, what you're trying to do is occupy as much space as quickly as possible to not leave room for the weeds, right? And it just makes sense. So if you can narrow your row spacing up, then you can get that less space for the weeds to grow between the rows, and et cetera. This may change in row crop, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, where you can actually control the weeds with tillage between the rows. But in small grains, often you can't do that, and maybe you're better off trying to suppress them in there anyway. So let's look at that. Here's some evidence from Saskatchewan. In this case, looking at our old friend lentil as well, looking at the different seeding rates in lentil and the row spacing. I kind of made this graph backwards just because it kind of makes more sense to see it trending this way. But you can see as you start with a wide row spacing at the higher seeding rates, but going to narrower row spacing does give you higher yields in the lentil. Like, interestingly enough, at the very low seeding rate, it didn't make a difference. And that probably makes sense in that at that low seeding rate, the crop wasn't even competing with itself. So row spacing didn't have enough of an effect. But as soon as you got enough there, that it did have an effect. But there's one thing that I did want to show you about here is that you need very large differences in the row spacing. For instance, going from 10 to 20, that's or from this case, let's say 45 to 25. You're essentially halving your row width, and you're making kind of a subtle difference in competition. Perhaps you could get that back by you can get that back a little bit by increasing your yield, by increasing your seeding rate as well. So the two interact with each other as well. Here's barley essentially showing the same trends there as well, although in the 1 year they kind of leveled off. But as you get your seeding row with narrower, you get under, and these are under organic weedy conditions. This is under weed-free conditions. This isn't always true, but under weedy conditions, you do tend to get a yield benefit. Although again, as I said, in this case, you're starting off for a small grain at quite wide row spacing. Well, I should talk inches. I guess you guys know the metric system because you're in science, but even up here in Canada, the metric system never really firmly took held. People still talk about row spacing in inches, even young farm kids these days. But anyways, in this case, this would be the equivalent of 18-inch row spacing. And normally our normal row spacing would be around 12 inches. And you can see there's a difference, but it isn't a huge difference. And that's what I wanted to say. So the principle would be to use as narrow row spacing as possible. But the reality is I shouldn't say there's little evidence. There's the differences between normal seed spacing. And the reason I say this is people will often, the decisions people have to make up here when buying a new air planter would be the difference between like a 10 and a 12-inch row spacing or a 12 and a 14. So they're only talking subtle differences in row spacing. They're not talking the difference between 30 inches and 10 inches or something like that. Nobody would ever consider making that large of a change. So the differences to be had by those subtle differences aren't that great. And seeding rate may overcome this. And obviously is a very expensive option. New seeders up here are in they're people buy huge equipment up here in Canada. It's not unusual to have an 80-foot air drill these days that cost, probably $500,000, right? So to spend that kind of amount of money on a new piece of machinery is to get a subtle difference in weed control. It doesn't pencil out to your return on investment. Let's start talking about combining tactics here. I'll talk here about a student of mine that Dil knew, Dilshan Benaragama, another good Sri Lankan. I've had a series of Sri Lankan students in my lab. So Dil wasn't ever in my lab, but she almost was, but I didn't have funding for it, interestingly enough. But anyways, that's a long story from years ago. And we'll talk about Dilshan looked at putting all these factors together. So putting together competitive and non-competitive variety, low and high seeding rate, row width, and using some mechanical weed control, which we haven't talked about yet, but we did use it in the lentil work. We used in-crop harrowing to help suppress the weeds as well, as that is a normal production practices. So this is what kind of they look like. This is kind of the base level normal agronomy that organic growers or indeed conventional growers would have been using at the time. Just a normal seeding rate, wide rows and unharrowed, going into a higher density, and the same thing with wide rows. Getting to the narrow rows, it certainly looks better. We can see more oat there. In this case, we're using oat as the crop. Oats like you'd get were used to make Cheerios or Quaker Oats or granola bars. Actually, if you buy Cliff bars, which I suspect many of you do. They always say 70% organic on them. Well, that 70% organic is from Canadian organic oats, pretty much guaranteed. They source most of their oats from Canada. So oats are one of the most important organic crops we have in Canada. And this is our if we want to call it our high-end treatment, where we had the high seeding rate, narrow rows, and harrows. So how did it compare to our base level treatment? So how did those compare averaged over 4 years? This is work Dilshan did. Well, we saw crop density, increasing our density, increased our grain yield by 11%. Harrowing increased our grain yield by 13%. Harrowing did a great job of controlling weeds in the years that they were there. One year, current in 2008, we actually had hardly any weeds under organic conditions, strangely enough, because it was a dry spring and we were able to seed it without the weeds germinating. But normally it was able to suppress the weeds quite well. And this, to give you an idea of the harrowing, this is the one, it was very photogenic that year. You could see the plots that were harrowed and weren't harrowed. One of the most problematic annual weed under organic conditions in Canada, in Western Canada, is wild mustard, which has these yellow flowers that are quite easy to see. So you can see the oats growing, which just look like grass. And you can see the harrowed plots quite easily here. You know, there's a unharrowed versus harrowed there. And here you can see the genotype effect. The more competitive, we used a forage oat variety that was more competitive that Dilshan had actually figured out in his part of his master's as well, had been more competitive. The crop density reduced weed biomass by a huge effect. So you had both that weed suppression and weed tolerance. The weed tolerance yielded more. The weed suppression has suppressed the weed biomass. And so overall, where did that leave us? Well, grain yield, when we put harrowing and high crop density together, that increased our yield by 25%. Those are the two factors there. In terms of weed biomass, by combining our three factors, competitive cultivar, high crop density, and harrowing, that reduced our weed biomass by 71% compared to normal agronomy, which we were very happy about, because herbicidal weed control is considered, to get a herbicide registered, you have to show 80% weed control. We were getting about 70% weed control using just organic methods. So we're pretty happy with that. Of course, we're never going to get as good as herbicides, you know. So, but we thought this was pretty, we're pretty happy with this. Interesting enough, in this study, row spacing had no effect. Going from a 12-inch row spacing to a 6-inch row spacing didn't have any effect on reducing the weed biomass or on increasing the yield. It was just too subtle of an effect to pull out. Next topic we'll talk about, next combined one we'll talk about is the mechanical weed control. After we did this, we continued to work in lentil, and we had this a great student, Alexander Alba from the Ukraine. True story. He ended up coming over to Canada as a graduate student because he was trying to avoid being drafted into the Ukraine army because he was scared he'd be killed by Russians. That's true. Yeah. So he was essentially a Ukrainian draft dodger that was in Canada. And so anyways, we want to look at 3 different mechanical weed controls, which I'll show you some videos of to give you a bit better idea of what they are. And the first was a rotary hoe. The second was a harrow. And the third was inter-row tillage. They all have optimum timing that is different. The rotary hoe is better just when the weeds are emerging. And here's the harrow. I'll go back. I got to start this. Hopefully the sound. So the harrows go through the crop. This is like what we call blind harrowing. It's going through the crop. And in this case, we're showing it in peas. We did this in peas and lentils. And you can see the small weeds is kind of pulling out, but there is obviously some crop damage from those harrow tines. But the idea is you're trying to find some differential tolerance of the harrowing that will give your crop, that will improve your weed control without hurting your weed too much. Next one I'll show, and I'll just silence the sound here, is rotary hoeing. And a rotary hoe will take out very small weeds with these spinning tines as they grow through. I know the animation's not showing perfectly here, but these tines spin around as it goes through the field, and it flicks out very small weeds. It only works when weeds are tiny. when weeds are in that what we sometimes call the white thread stage, when they're just emerging, and they'll come out. Finally, we looked at inter-row tillage, which is a bit more easy to understand. We used a manual guidance system because these were on 12-inch rows to steer the shanks between the crop rows to pull out those weeds that grow in between the crop rows. Of course, it doesn't get the weeds that grow within the crop row, as you can see here, but we want to compare these all essentially head to head. And so, well, what did we find out? Well, here you can see some with the weed control, this showing the stage that you would get the weeds at in the rotary hoeing. The harrowing, the stage, the weeds can be a bit larger, and then the inter-row tillage, which looks impressive, but which leaves weeds in the row. Yeah, and here you can get an example of the visual control. What struck us first in this, and we did this over multiple site years, again, 4 site years, is that the rotary hoeing worked really well. Alex was out there and he made sure his crops got hit at exactly the right time. Rotary hoeing has to be done within a day or two of the optimum time. The weeds are just emerging. If it's too early, there's nothing to kill. If it's too late, the roots get too firmly anchored in the soil. So what did we find? Well, we found that our old friend seeding rate was able to decrease the weed biomass by 16%. And when we look at the mechanical weed control here at our different treatments, what we saw is our single levels of mechanical weed control. In this case here, the rotary hoe, the harrowing, and the inter-row tillage. As soon as we doubled them up and had 2 in there, we got much better control. And what came out as our winner was using a rotary hoe or using a rotary hoe early, then following it up with inter-row tillage. We're able to decrease our weed biomass over the unweeded control by about 76%. In terms of crop yield, the other side of it, increasing our seeding rate, increased our yield by 30% in lentil, and rotary hoe and inter-row tillage and others increased our seed yield by about 55%, 50 to 60% on average. So we're getting quite reasonable yields and quite a good system for organic. So we're very happy about that. I think I've got a couple minutes to talk about but another thing we've done some work on is weed clipping in short crops, to use machinery that's designed to clip the weeds above the crop to try to reduce, in this case, weed seed set. As I'll show you, that it didn't really reduce weed growth per se. It didn't increase the crop competition with it because the weeds had already done it. And this was based on a study that Eric Johnson, a colleague of mine, did, where he looked at clipping weeds in lentil, and he saw that it reduced the emergence of the crop after. And so the idea would be is that in this case, lentils here, that the weeds would be clipped above the crop. And it looks impressive because you're getting rid of these weeds that are growing above the crop, and you're not seeing these big yellow flowers waving at you. But does it do any good? Well, we did some research on that. And here you can see the clipped by the unclipped plots. And you can see that obviously there is a difference in how many heads are there. And you can see our mustard seed production was decreased by, according to our week of it. And basically optimum is about our second week of flowering for the mustard if we got clipping in there. And then if we clipped 2 times, if we started about the second week and then clipped twice, we could get it here. And I think this is a video just showing this machine. Well, it's hard to see, but it goes through and clips the weeds on top of it. There's a few different options for that, but just that. However, it has no effect on the yield of the lentil because the weeds are already competing with them. So it influences the weed seed return. So you would essentially only do this for your next year population. So to sum up, increasing seeding rate, that's kind of the big hammer in all of this. Timely in-crop mechanical weed control with rotary hoe or harrows and inter-row tillage can kill weeds. You put these together, increasing the seeding rate and that's a good package for organic farmers. And above crop canopy clipping has some potential to reduce weed seed return, but doesn't affect the crop yield. This is some acknowledgements here. I won't worry about going over who's paying for this, because I doubt if anybody is watching this, but the Sask Pulse growers at Western Grains paid for a lot. And that's the end of this. So I'll stop sharing screen and see if there's any questions here.
Thank you, Dr. Shirtliffe. That was great. Really appreciate it. We did get quite a few questions trickling in throughout your presentation.
I saw the chat. I saw the chat thing light up. These students must be getting marks for asking questions or something.
There's quite a crowd here.
Is there?
Yeah. A lot of folks in attendance and a lot of questions have come in.
Okay.
I believe Dill might be helping sort through some of these questions with me, but I'll start from the top with sort of like a high level question of understanding everything you just said about your sort of 3 take homes for weed management and organic small grain crops. I'm curious if you have any opinions other than that, perhaps, or following up on those about where you might see organic weed management going in the future, next 10 years. Are there new technologies or new techniques?
Well, obviously, the robotic weed control is the one thing that is poised to really change mechanical weed control. These were all dumb systems, that they just go through and and don't have any. Well, I guess the cultivator that can be steered by a graduate student isn't a dumb system. It's that's a wonderfully intelligent biomechanical integration. Kind of a cyborg version, but that has and we're starting to see stuff come on the market, and it's not a big difference, in some cases engineering wise, to make the difference between having a camera actuator that triggers a linear spray system or triggers or some kind of hoeing or mechanical system that does it. So those are the ones that really have some potential. Of course, even the herbicide ones, huge potential to reduce herbicide rate. Most herbicide, greater than 99% of herbicide gets sprayed on places where there are no weeds at all, right? It's like trying to vaccinate people by dropping needles out of an airplane, right? It just doesn't make sense, Yeah.
Yeah, understood. It seems that spot spraying technology could even be applied to an organic system, because there are a handful of organic.
Yeah, and they are. I know we've worked with some of those ones, and the problem has been that they've been too pricey, right? To blanket spray. But if you're just spraying them on the weeds, suddenly that changes the whole economics, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Do you have any thoughts on in-row weeds?
Oh yeah, they're really bad. They're really competitive. Obviously, the ones in the row are the ones that are most competitive because they're the neighbors that are closest to you, shading you out. The thing I didn't get into, kind of, crop. Animals have the great thing. If we want to find more food, we run around and look for it. Plants are stuck in one place. If you've got a big, fat, greedy neighbor, i.e. a weed that's shading you out, it never gets better, right? They have more light. They grow faster than you do. It just keeps getting worse. So the proximity and the relative size of that means that competition is asymmetric. It's not symmetric. If somebody is 10% bigger than you, they have more than a 10% advantage on you. Yeah. Yeah. I should also mention, I've covered a narrow range of organic weed control, the whole crop rotations, cover crops. Those are all techniques here, but I just focused on the area that we did, and we kind of worked on that, modifying crop competition and interventionalist techniques. So that's just where I am. So I don't want to take it away that there isn't more than this. Yeah.
Of course. Well, I'll start at the top with chipping away at some of the questions that have been posed here, and then we can move through them as we go. So let me back up a tad. I'm just going to read this one. If a plot has the problem of weeds from the last few years, there might be a possibility that the soil of the plot itself contains weeds in the seed bank. I'm doing a little bit of modifying the words here as we go.
Sure. Okay.
And even by using a competitive variety, and increasing seed rate, there might still be weeds that come through, which might produce the following year. Do you have any thoughts on how to eliminate all these weed seeds in soil?
Well, think of them as an heirloom that you will pass on to your future. Those, you will never eliminate all of them. They do decline slowly, but seeds can live for an incredible amount of time. There is some, in the past couple of years, there was some. They managed to get some date palm seeds that had been stored in Masad, when the Temple of Masad, or in the fortress of Masad, before, in 200 BC, they managed seeds that were over 2,000 years old. They managed to get growing. Seeds can stay viable for a long, long, long time. Yeah, and but there's a lot of bad things that can happen to them. There's a lot of soil can break them down. There's a lot of biology in the soil that can break them down. There's micro and macro fauna. Seeds, we eat seeds primarily. That's where humans get most of their food from. A lot of things in the wild get seeds from there, from rodents, from mice to insects. So weed seeds represent something out there that is a good meal. So a lot of them will get consumed through predation, etc. But maybe that gets to my point about managing weed seed return. And those old farmer adages. 1 year's weeding, it means 7 years. Or no, 1 year's seeding means 7 years weeding. That's an old English one that dates back to the Middle Ages, and they're actually underestimating the length of the seed bank. Because small hard seeds, like pigweeds. You guys got a lot of amaranths, problems with amaranths or lamb's quarters. Those small, hard weed seeds can last decades. Yeah. So, yeah.
Do you think that there's any opportunity to work the seed bank, like stale seed bedding? I know we're only talking about full season crops.
Basically, so there's two techniques. You either try to let sleeping dogs lie, to use a stale seed bed technique to not get them going, or you try to deplete it. And, going into a rotation with something with a perennial crop, it tends to do both, because the ones that do grow, the perennial crops can outcompete them. If you're growing something like alfalfa and et cetera. Tillage is used sometimes. We have trouble with tillage up here because if we do too much of it, we have troubles with erosion. So we're always trying to balance that thing. But tillage can stimulate emergence. So the idea of stimulating emergence, but there's only going to be a certain there's only going to be a certain portion. You're never going to get them all to grow. People tried that in the 70s. There was even at the University of Saskatchewan, some people are actually trying to research ways of stimulating all the weed seeds to grow in the seed bank and then killing them all and then having it perfectly thing, and nothing. Biology finds a way around that, right? Yeah. It was never successful.
Yeah, and it seems that it's pretty difficult to do in cool season crops when the soil is wetter. There's little opportunity to work that seed bank with tillage prior to planting. Well, I'm going to continue on down through some of the questions. The next question in the line was about whether applying herbicides periodically, because you might have a bad weedy year, whether that might affect your status as a certified organic farm. And I'll just answer that yes, that would affect your status. So. At least in the States, and I'm assuming any equivalent.
Yeah, it's organic is essentially, it's a rule-based system, and the key kind of prohibition rules are no synthetic herbicides or synthetic pesticides for 3 years prior to going organic, right? Yeah. Please keep talking metric. Oh, well, sorry about that.
So let's see, next question. I'm reluctant to ask because I don't know this weed. How can we control Parthenon weeds in chickpea crop using mechanical methods?
What kind of weeds?
It says Parthenon. Not sure if that's meant to say parasitic or something else.
There may be some daughter. They may be talking about daughter if they meant parasitic weeds. And parasitic weeds where they exist, and the Carolinas, interestingly enough, you still have a little bit of there's still a little bit of whatchamacallit, not dodder, but the parasitic weed in maize, witchweed. There's still a tiny, tiny bit because you guys had an eradication campaign there. I used to use it in my example when I taught weeds. But anyway, so parasitic weeds completely change the competitive thing, because a parasitic weed doesn't play by the rules. It isn't just trying to shade out its neighbor. It's actually like tapping in like intravenously into its host and sucking the sap out of the thing. So those weeds, a parasitic weed, it's very important to try to eliminate them even when they appear small and that sort of thing. But I don't have any experience with that, so that's all I can really say is just principles. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you.
That's what they're talking about.
I am not sure. There very well might be a weed called Parthenon in some other place that we don't know.
Yeah, I've never heard of it, but I'm not a. Yeah.
Okay, so a lot of these questions we've already addressed, so I'm just going to keep moving on.
Okay.
So John asks, are you or any of your colleagues investigating different types of cultivation tools, perhaps in addition to the ones we've talked about? I'm aware of some interesting between-row and in-row cultivation tools from Japan. In particular, these tools combine rotary hoe-type tools and torsion weeder-style tools.
Yeah, no, we haven't done anything like that. Some of my colleagues in Quebec have looked at those type, and those are usually more for wider row spacing crops to get those torsion weeders in there and stuff like that. You tend to need a bit wider row spacing. So just our small grain system, where we're usually dealing with 30 centimeter rows, back to the metric system. I can't remember who that was. There's just not there's just a limitation to what kind of tools you can get between there. Yeah.
Yeah, in-row weed control seems really tight in a 7.5 inch row.
Yeah.
No finger weeders. Okay, moving on. Yeah, so okay, I'm just going to keep moving on. We've kind of addressed a lot of these.
I think we have to leave fairly soon. I just have to keep time on the mind too, because I have another talk to give at 10 o'clock my time, gotcha. Which is in 13 minutes.
We will be brief.
Okay.
So Eric Gallant asks, it is
Eric
rare.
Gallant, hey!
He's here. It is the rare seed that lasts so long. Most seeds do not last so long in the soil, and we are managing the large number of weeds. Sorry, that is just a comment. I apologize. Not the rare long-lived individual. Even pigweed has a half-life of only 1.5 years. I apologize.
Yeah, that's the thing. There's that decay. So, like, most of them will be, as Eric says, and Eric's done more work on this than anybody almost, and that most of them will die, but it's kind of like it's like any kind of survivorship kind of curve that you get there, that there'll be a few that live on forever. It's not like it's going to be terribly bad, and those first few years are the key ones. If you do get a bad seeding event, if you can reduce seed rain return after those years, it'll be difficult. And I think our soils, we're cold up here, so we don't have as much biological activity. This changes, I think, when you get to areas where there's more tillage and more biological activity in the soil. But I know, yeah, so it does change. But hey, hello, Eric. Great to see you, Matt. Or great that you're there.
Okay.
Eric, of course, the co-author of the great organic weed control manifesto, I can even call it. Many Little Hammers. He was a co-author of that.
Okay, I think that's to the end of our questions. John asked if we can share speaker contact information again. We can do that with you separately if it doesn't pop up at the end of this talk when we wrap up.
Sure, and I can share my slides. Did you guys record this, I think? Yeah, okay.
Yes, and then for the final few questions in the Q&A section, I'm going to focus on that because I know we don't have a lot of time. Drop your comments or questions in the Q&A or in the chat as we go, but to start addressing some of those, there was a question about why row spacing had no effect on weed biomass. I know you showed a lot of data on that for a few different crops, so I'm not sure which one that was referring to specifically.
I think that was an oat, and I think we were just, I think it's just kind of a declining return, we were in a very real, like were we even at 12 inches? Maybe those, yeah, no, I think, it's just because that difference wasn't large enough to, and there's always the trouble with variability in field studies as well. There probably would have been a small effect. It's just our experimental design wasn't sensitive enough to pull it out. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So Uta McKevley asks if, essentially, if you all have done any economic analysis, or if others have done any economic analyses on the cost of driving equipment through the field for mechanical
actually,
cultivation.
Alex did that. He didn't publish it, but it's in his thesis, and he found it was that these techniques, if you the capital costs of when you amortize it and then look at the weed control, it was more than justified for the
Gotcha. Thank you. And Tony asks if so working from this idea of increasing seeding rate to decrease weed pressure and increase yield a bit, did you all see any increases in disease pressure, particularly in maybe the pulse crops that are more susceptible?
Interestingly enough, we didn't, and we kind of expected to, because there was some evidence that we could be spreading disease and that sort of thing. But it's we never saw the disease levels that we expected to see, and we looked for it, and we worked in some years that should have been more disease laden, and there seemed to be just actually having some weeds in there really cut down on our foliar disease transmittability and that sort of thing, and maybe gets into some of those intercropping benefits where our weed was a freeloader intercropper, kind of thing that was breaking up the canopy enough to do it, to stop it. But we didn't test this. That's just a hypothesis. But we did, in other trials, other studies where we looked at with conventional situations, we did make that observation, and we've never tested it, that where there was weeds, it always seemed that we noted that the disease rating for those plots tended to be lower. Yeah.